Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences breakout session tonight. We're so pleased you made the time to be here. My name is Megan Hinckley, and I'm a member of the Dean's Office in SHAS. Like you, I'm looking forward to learning more about the politics of molecular medicine from Professor Robin Wolf Scheffler, who I now have the pleasure of introducing. Professor Scheffler is a historian of the modern biological and biomedical sciences in the program in Science, Technology, and Society in MIT School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. He has written on the history of exercise science, humor in science, cancer, and biotechnology. His first book was A Contagious Cause, The American Hunt for Cancer Viruses and the Rise of Molecular Medicine, which our Dean, Melissa Nobles, has described as a page turner. He is currently writing Genetown, a history of the biotechnology industry around Boston. He received MIT's 2018 Leviton Prize in the Humanities, as well as a grant from the National Science Foundation to support this work. Professor Scheffler has been a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Rockefeller Archive Center, and the National Institutes of Health Office of History. After earning undergraduate degrees in history and chemistry from the University of Chicago, Professor Scheffler completed a doctorate in the history of science and medicine from Yale and a Master of Philosophy in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. Without further ado, I turn the session over to you, Professor Scheffler.
Wonderful. Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. And I'm so happy to be talking with all of you virtually tonight. What I'm going to be talking with you on the theme of molecular medicine is something that I started thinking about in the course of working on my first book, A Contagious Cause, The American Hunt for Cancer Viruses and the Rise of Molecular Medicine. And that was a book that started from the surprising observation, at least initially to me, that 1 out of 6 cancers around the world are actually preventable from vaccination. And following the twin histories of cancer and vaccination was really exciting for me because it brings everything together. There's, of course, the history of research against cancer, a dread disease, the question and politics of vaccination, which is on everybody's mind today as a result of the new vaccines announced against COVID in the last few weeks, but also politics and who decides what's important to advance public health and the role that the biological sciences have in advancing it. And in particular, this persistent idea that I came across in cancer research, but I see in many other parts of contemporary medicine and society, which is this idea of molecular medicine. And that's what I'll spend most of my talk thinking about, is what the political implications of molecular medicine are. However, before I begin, one might ask, what is molecular medicine? It's a slippery term. I'm like many of you, I initially associated molecules and being molecular with sort of this type of a diagram here, sort of thinking about molecules as something very small. But throughout the 20th century, molecules have encompassed a huge variety of substances and compounds, everything from very simple chemicals, such as various forms of helium, all the way up to incredibly complex proteins and enzymes. And really, the difference in scale here is immense. So molecular medicine encompasses all of these levels. It can focus on the immune system, it can focus on DNA, it can focus on vaccination and viruses. But what all of these ideas of molecular medicine carry with them is a commitment to the idea that medicine is being acted upon at its most fundamental and basic level. And that's sort of the promise and dream of molecular medicine, which I have to say is unfortunately a term coined by a member of one of MIT's rivals, the chemist, molecular biologist, Linus Pauling at Caltech back in the 1950s. So this vision of molecular medicine is really important, especially if you consider the fact that talking about molecules is really only one way of talking about medicine and talking about disease. So for example, in the case of cancer, in the early 20th century, the idea that cancer had molecular roots and that studying those molecular roots could provide some useful means of treating the disease was the furthest thing from the minds of most doctors and surgeons involved with the disease. They instead focused on this message of early detection and early treatment. And this was a way of talking about cancer, which even was dismissive for many scientists and doctors, of the very idea that science would have a useful contribution to make to addressing cancer as a problem in any form, to say nothing of being a molecular form. And indeed, the idea that cancer might be caused by a transmissible agent had a whiff of quackery to it. The idea of cancer viruses, for example, existed uneasily next to other ideas that cancer could be contagious, such as promises to find a cancer germ. And this ad here for a fly spray is actually in reference to a 1926 Nobel Prize awarded to Johannes Feinberger for his purported discovery that extracts of roach were capable of transmitting cancer in mice. This was a quote unquote discovery that was later overturned. But this idea of trying to find an infectious agent responsible for cancer, to understand cancer at this more fundamental level, really has as an uneasy and sort of definitely it's hardly within the mainstream of science. It's extremely controversial, but it's counterbalanced as the century goes on with growing confidence in vaccination. And this, of course, is due to a number of factors. Of course, there are major advances in virology. We have instruments such as electron microscopes, which allow us to see viruses in much more concrete ways than simply sort of studying them in the abstract. In the intervening years between looking for a cancer germ in the 1920s and the launch of the special virus leukemia program in the 1960s, you also have really big notable advances such as the polio vaccine, and much more confidence that it will be possible to identify the viral roots of diseases and combat them through vaccination. But the other thing that's changed, and this is what makes thinking about the politics of molecules so interesting for me, is an attitude towards research. And if you look at this logo for the Special Virus Leukemia Program, which was a program that's becomes larger than the American Human Genome Project, so it spends billions upon billions of dollars to develop a leukemia vaccine and then vaccines against other types of cancer, I want you to look at the top of this logo, sort of the hexagons, and then that sort of white hatched line leading down to the person. And those white hatched, those hexagons are viruses. And the white hatched line, unlike all the other solid lines, for example, showing that we know that there are viruses that cause cancer in animals, or that radiation causes cancer in both animals and humans, or on the bottom, chemicals cause cancer in animals and humans. That hatched line is a promise of a discovery to come. It's a promise of a future discovery. And at the peak of optimism for vaccination against cancer, this was an incredibly powerful idea that somehow the future could be planned for, and a vaccine could be almost willed into being. And that's sort of the point of this publicity shot at the National Cancer Institute in the United States, which contains two future directors of the institute during the war on cancer of the 1970s. And what I like about this drawing is that really these men could be planning almost anything. They could be planning a building project. They could be planning a bombing campaign. But what they are planning, in fact, is the distribution of a cancer vaccine, which this program, using these sort of methods drawn from military style management, framed as a question of when a virus would be discovered and then speeding a vaccine, as opposed to focusing on the scientific question of, are there human cancer viruses? And indeed, this program exists for over 15 years, despite never actually identifying a human cancer virus. And you might think that this is simply typical of the way that bureaucrats or managers can overpromise for the sake of trying to get something done. But this isn't an isolated incident. In the early 1970s, the planning methods of the Special Virus Leukemia Program are the basis of this massive push in the United States called the War on Cancer, which by my reckoning is the single largest peacetime biomedical research effort ever launched. So this is a huge effort, and it's one grounded on the conviction that science is going to reveal the molecular roots of cancer, whether or not they be viral or genetic. And it's also based on the faith that the government can plan it in advance, and that this research can be directed towards a goal as opposed to simply waiting for discoveries to be applied. And it's no coincidence that the methods that are used to plan the war on cancer are actually the same methods that are being used to direct the war in Vietnam, and also the same methods that are being used to engineer the American Apollo program and the moon and its effort to land on the moon. So these are all big programs designed to get a lot done on a very short timetable, and sort of that urgency of war is very much a part of what makes molecular medicine molecular medicine. And so this has been sort of, I've sketched out so far some of the political dimensions of this, but the return cycle, what happens when these visions of political molecular medicine begin to shape research, are also really interesting. And for those of you who remember walking around MIT, this happens very close to home. This is building E17 on the MIT campus, which was a former chocolate factory, which was taken over and repurposed into a laboratory, the Center for Cancer Research, underneath molecular biologists such as Salvador Luria. And this was thanks to a massive infusion of cash from the National Cancer Institute during the war on cancer. And in particular, viruses are very important here because they're a bridge between work with bacteria, which is where a lot of molecular biology had originally been done, and the complex eukaryotic cells of the human body. So they provide both a system of thinking about vaccination, but also a model for molecular biologists migrating from one type of research to another. And this is something that happens at MIT because of that faith in the potential for molecular medicine. And otherwise, MIT, which doesn't have a medical school, would have been probably unlikely to get that involved into cancer research. But not everybody is happy about this. Indeed, James Watson, the Harvard molecular biologist who speaks at the dedication of the MIT Cancer Research Center in 1975, takes his speech as an opportunity to bash the idea that molecular biology and cutting-edge biology by extension should be used as a means of treating medicine. Watson condemns the National Cancer Institute in his speech and in many other venues during the 1970s for encouraging a focus on second-rate scientific problems. And here, this is the challenge of talking about molecules, is for Watson and others who see molecular biology as being patterned on physics and its quest for the fundamental nature of things, being concerned with trying to treat diseases such as cancer is a distraction from that fundamental quest, because according to Watson, cancer, and by extension the molecular biology of human cells, is simply too complex a problem to be solved on a short timetable, and therefore the government should sort of stay away and allow molecular biologists to conduct research independently. He is, however, perfectly happy to take the money. He just doesn't want to promise any results. And so despite this sort of emphasis on planning and urgency you see in the Special Virus Leukemia Program or the War on Cancer, and the massive amounts of money they mobilize for research, by the end, this vision of autonomous molecular biology wins out. And by the time you get to the American Human Genome Project in the 1980s, the focus is very much on letting the government take the backseat and let scientists and later biotechnology companies take the lead in determining what research should actually be conducted. And this is very much a political statement about the nature of research, which is that certain things are just too complicated to be solved. And if they're too complicated, the best thing to do is to give scientists autonomy. And that is a political statement. And today, of course, we've made great advances in molecular medicine, in molecular biology. There's a series of related fields in, say, precision medicine or personal medicine. And these are very central to how we relate to the question of approaching cancer and other diseases. And these have all been hopeful and beneficial developments. But in conclusion, I want us to think about what we miss when we look down into the molecules as our way of understanding disease and medicine for society. For example, there's nothing in molecular medicine that addresses the need to restrict smoking as a way of addressing cancer, which is arguably the most significant public health intervention of the late 20th century. This is, of course, a problem where it's not especially exciting from a molecular biology perspective, but it's nonetheless an incredibly meaningful act to restrict smoking. And it's not something that you see if you're only focused on molecules. And this is exactly what I mean when I say that molecular medicine is political. We make choices to understand particular diseases in particular ways at particular times. And we can think about the power politics of that. And sure, for many of you, the idea of President Trump's Operation Warp Speed has an obvious political connotation. And we should keep in mind that this is exactly what thinking about the politics of molecular medicine means, that alongside molecules, there are also all these other public health and social ways of thinking about health, such as mask wearing, as Tim the Beaver encouraged us to do. And these sort of simple solutions can often be equally meaningful. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. All right. So thank you, Megan. There's a few questions that are coming up in the comments, and thank you very much for your comments. So one question is, how would cancer care be done differently if it were not so focused on molecules? And this is a great question. And one of the things that I was struck by in the growth of molecular medicine is the effort, which is not just from scientists, but also from activists, to think about solving problems at their fundamental root. And that's, for example, the contrast between spending money on trying to research the causes of disease or even doing research on, say, immunotherapy, sort of advanced treatments for cancer, versus an awareness that in a city such as Boston today, there are many people who don't get chemotherapy because they simply can't afford cab fare. So one thing could simply be making sure that people in society already have access to good treatments as opposed to focusing on cutting edge treatments for people who have access to care, which is, of course, a feature which reflects the politics of health in the United States and would look very different in a country such as Canada. So another question is, are there advances in molecular medicine attributable to the war on cancer? Yes, there are probably, I think, 3 or 4 Nobel Prizes that come out of the work sponsored by the war on cancer. The one that I spend a lot of time thinking about is the discovery of oncogenes by Howard Varmus and J. Michael Bishop in San Francisco in 1976. And this is a discovery that would have been impossible without deep support from the war on cancer. The irony, of course, is that in looking for an external agent of cancer, they were looking for cancer viruses. They end up finding proof that oncogenes are responsible for cancer from within. And this exactly then brings me to, I guess, another question, which is sort of then what do I think of the politics of talking about molecular medicine versus other approaches? And one of the things that I've been struck by in the history of cancer, and I've talked a bit about this in the case of COVID as well, is just that the optimism and hope that goes into harnessing a vaccine can't be the only way we talk about these things. So, and that's a debate that's playing out right now. There's now at least 2 vaccines that seem promising, one from Pfizer and one from the Cambridge-based biotech Moderna, but they face a whole host of problems that will cause, not problems, but challenges if they are effective in terms of being distributed. In the meantime, so low-tech solutions such as social distancing and wearing masks are a much more immediate way of reducing the harm inflicted by COVID. And moreover, the harms that COVID has inflicted on a country like the United States are amplified by social inequalities that a vaccine is unlikely to help resolve, even if it were completely effective and completely available right now. And I guess this gets into an interesting point that a historian of technology raises, which is alongside the politics of molecular medicine, which is what might be called the politics of simple solutions, which is that very often there's almost an inverse correlation between how easy it is to state a solution to a problem and how easy it is to implement. So something, for example, like the United States is currently dealing with, in the sense of why don't we just have everyone wear masks, is very easy to state. Similarly, why can't we just simply reduce the number of people smoking? Those are both easy to see as actions, but actually deeply complicated to implement because of the various levels of social protest. But nonetheless, simply focusing on the complex molecular problems are hard to state, but seductive in the sense that they provide an answer. So there's a few other problems coming up. There's a follow-up in terms of what will COVID long haulers, people who've been infected and had symptoms of COVID, are still dealing with it, and there aren't a lot of drugs for those to deal with those people, and that's exactly right. And this is also a problem, for example, that popped up around polio, where you'd have many people who survived an infection with polio and it became a chronic illness for them, and the vaccines against polio did nothing to address that problem. This is exactly what I think is important to sort of keep in mind, that molecular medicine is but one way of talking about medicine. And there's another question: can molecular medicine be applied to genomics, the metabolome, epigenome, sort of a lot of the cutting edge research which is coming out of places like Stanford, Harvard, excuse me, and I would add MIT, of course. And I think that's exactly what I think molecular medicine captures for me, is that it's a method of thinking as opposed to simply a way of studying. And once again, all of genomics, metabolomics, microbiomics are all promises to sort of resolve problems at a fundamental level through scientific research. And there might be other levels to that problem that we should be thinking about as well. So this another question coming in is, how has thinking evolved over time on the oversight of spending versus scientific autonomy, especially for government-funded research? And yes, I think this is a really interesting point, which is that, I mean, I should mention that one of the reasons I talk so much about the United States is that the National Institutes of Health in the United States is the single largest supporter of biomedical research. Historically, they have a strong commitment. This is another question coming in to funding what's called basic science, which is scientific research, and in particular basic biology for its own sake. And they, at least until very recently, outspent the rest of the world combined. So they're a large actor, and their original system of dealing with research had been very much focused on the idea of autonomy and peer review, so giving a lot of independence to scientists. But the push around the war on cancer was a time when it appeared likely that the government was going to take a more active role in managing this. And what happens with the push for molecular medicine, as I mentioned with Watson, is that the claim that medicine is molecular is not just a claim about what disease is, it's also a political claim that molecules are too complicated for government bureaucrats to understand, and that scientists should be allowed to regulate themselves. And that's why it's notable to me that out of the people who are major opponents of the war on cancer, they embrace the freedom that's offered for them by the early biotechnology industry. So I think that's been a difficult arc, is how scientists are, what obligations they take on with public funding for their work. And I guess this is the final question, because we're coming up on the end of our time. And thank you for sending these questions over to me. What would I recommend? How is sort of the study of philosophy of science as a high impact way to understand and generate insights for scientific progress? In what ways is this more important than direct research? And the thing that I think about, the thing that I tell MIT undergraduates today, is that it's very good to be able to solve problems, but you need to understand exactly what problem it is you're solving. And that's where I think that a field such as science and technology studies is so important, because it allows all of us who are interested in the progress of science and medicine to understand what particular type of problem we are trying to solve in that moment, and how we might think about that problem differently. And that's a level of perspective that is hard to generate from within any one scientific field.
Thank you, Professor Scheffler, for that fascinating presentation. And thank you to our audience members for submitting so many thoughtful, provocative questions. This made for a very lively and engaging conversation, and we are most grateful for your participation. You can see that we have shared some links to additional resources in the chat box in case you were interested in learning more about Professor Scheffler and his work. We hope you enjoy them. And we appreciate your time and enthusiasm, and we look forward to seeing you at future MIT events.